Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, it's Mikki here. You are listening to Mikkipedia, and this week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Peter Brukner. He is one of the OGs in the low carbohydrate diet space and also a leading sports physician in Australia. So we discuss on the podcast how a personal sort of health challenge led Peter to investigate low carbohydrate diets to help improve his own health. And this was under the influence of Professor Tim Noakes, who at the time was beginning to speak out about low carb diets, about the Banting diet and real food revolution. Peter's own success with improving his metabolic markers then got him interested in the wider application of the approach for fat loss, improving blood sugar control, and reversing symptoms of type 2 diabetes. And this led Dr. Brukner from his very successful sports medicine interest into the space of population health and to educate and inform on the power of low carbohydrate diets for chronic disease. And we talk a lot about this in today's podcast. This has led Peter to write a book, Fat Lot of Good, set up a not-for-profit organisation, Sugar by Half, and a new diabetes reversal program, Defeat Diabetes. And this is an online program to help scale his reach in order to help people reverse their type 2 diabetes risk. Those of you unfamiliar with Dr. Brukner, he's a specialist sports and exercise physician whose most recent position has been Australian cricket team doctor for the past 5 years. Peter is the founding partner of Olympic Park Sports Medicine Centre in Melbourne and Professor of Sports Medicine at La Trobe University. A founding executive member of Australasian College of Sports Physicians, he served 2 terms as president and played a key role in establishing sports medicine as a medical specialty in Australia. Peter is the co-author of the widely used textbook Clinical Sports Medicine, and that is actually the first time I saw Dr. Peter Brukner's work was in fact that sports book, and has been team physician for professional football clubs as well as national athletics, swimming, soccer and men's hockey teams, including Olympic and Commonwealth Games. Peter was the Socceroos team doctor at the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, more recently head of sports medicine and sports science at Liverpool Football Club. Peter is also, as I mentioned, the co-founder of the public health campaign Sugar by Half and is committed to the challenge of improving the nation's health with improved diet and increased physical activity. And I have included links to the Defeat Diabetes website and the book A Fat Lot of Good in the show notes. Before we crack on into this interview, which I know you will love, just a reminder that the best way to support the podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favourite podcast listening platform. This increases the visibility of the podcast out there in amongst the literally thousands of other podcasts, so more people get the opportunity to learn from guests like Dr. Brukner that I have on the show. All right, team, enjoy this conversation with Dr. Peter Brukner. Peter Brukner, Dr. Brukner, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me this afternoon. You would be one of the first people that I was aware of when I sort of entered, if you like, the low carb sort of space after my sort of nutrition training and the usual sort of traditional route. Yours was certainly one of the first names that I became aware of in particular sort of Australia and New Zealand. So I sort of look at you as a bit of an OG in the low carb space.
Right, well.
But of course, I think that's how you do it, though, because I think you are like the OG in sports medicine.
Well, I don't know about that, but I certainly my career has sort of transitioned a little bit really in the last sort of 10 years, I suppose. I was very much focused on sports medicine for all of my career. Worked in sports medicine for many years, had a clinic here in Melbourne, Australia, and then worked with a whole bunch of sporting teams, sort of very involved in establishing sports medicine as a medical specialty in Australia and New Zealand, and sort of co-author of sort of the sports medicine Bible, which is clinical sports medicine. So that was my sort of sports medicine career, and then sort of the last 10 years, I guess I've become interested, to put it mildly, in the world of nutrition, and not so much sports nutrition really, more just sort of life nutrition, health nutrition for general health as much as anything, and that all arose from my own personal experience, as so often these things do. And I had a sort of a life-changing experience, and from then on, I've been sort of passionate about the importance of nutrition, which I probably didn't appreciate until I had my own experience.
Yeah, and as I understand it, you've been involved at like the absolute upper echelon of sport for many, many years, and you've had almost not an integration, even though you don't focus on sports nutrition now because you're much more so in that sort of health space. I understand that you've got experience helping some of the athletes that you worked with sort of utilize your sort of more low carb approach with their own health, which then of course backs onto their performance as well. Can you, Peter, just sort of describe how you even got interested in the low carb? I mean, I know from a personal perspective, I've heard you talk before about having a bit of, that middle-aged spread, but what sort of engineered your thinking in this space?
Right. Well, it all sort of started 10 years ago now. And I was living and working in Liverpool, England. I was head of sports medicine at the football club there. And I just turned 60. And if people had asked me then, if you'd sort of bumped into me and said, how was I? I'd have said, yeah, I'm fine. I'm good health. I'm pretty good. I wasn't on any sort of medication. I didn't have any sort of particular health issues. I had what I thought was a good diet. I exercised regularly. My blood sugars were fine. My cholesterol was fine. But the reality was I probably wasn't quite as healthy as I thought I was. Well, I certainly wasn't as healthy as I thought I was. For a start, I had a family history of type 2 diabetes. So my father had developed type 2 diabetes at exactly that age, and I was pretty keen to avoid that fate because I saw what happened to him, and I didn't want to go down that track. I was borderline obese. I was certainly overweight, probably on the borderline of obese. And like many middle-aged men, and I considered 60 middle-aged. I used to think it was old, but now I think it's middle-aged.
Totally.
Like many 60-year-old men, I'd probably put on half a kilogram a year for 30 years, to the point where I was 15 kilograms overweight. As well, I had some metabolic issues. I had high triglycerides, had a high insulin level. I'd had a fatty liver for about 10 years that I was aware of. Regular blood tests showed fatty liver, and like a typical doctor, I totally ignored it, and I sort of figured I was on a low-fat diet, and I didn't really understand what a fatty liver was, to be honest, and I ignored it. So, I clearly wasn't, and in retrospect, I was clearly pre-diabetic. I mean, and have no doubt that had I continued on the way I was going, I'd have been, fully fledged type 2 diabetic, within probably a couple of years. But what happened was I'm quite good friends with Tim Noakes, the South African sports scientist, doctor, and now sort of a banting guru. And Tim and I go back a long way. We've been friends for years. And around that time, he came out and stated that he thought we had nutrition all wrong, and that it was actually sugar and processed carbohydrates that were the problem and not fats. And I thought, oh, come on, Tim, you've really gone a bit too far this time. You can't tell me that we've all been on the wrong diet for the last 40 years. But Tim had actually challenged a couple of previous gospel truths in sports science, and had eventually been proven right on both occasions. So I thought, no, look, I can't just ignore this. I need to look into it. So I bought a book. I bought Gary Taub's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and I guess that was sort of the book that changed my life, really. I wouldn't tell Gary that, he's pretty arrogant as it is. But no, the book. I mean, I remember reading this book, and not only did it talk about the sort of the relative merits of carbs and fats, which was interesting in itself, but more interestingly, it talked about the politics and the history of how the low fat movement has sort of won out over the low carb movement, or the low sugar movement back in the sort of, the 60s and so on. And which I'd always assume was due to sort of, science and evidence and all that sort of stuff. But in fact, turned out to be due to, money and ego and power and the influence of the US agriculture system. So this book really blew me away. I remember, sitting down on the edge of my bed at night, having just been reading for a while and thinking, nah, this couldn't be right. Like, this could not be right. We could not have all been on the wrong diet for 40 years. And yet, I then dived into every book and journal article and paper and everything I could get my hands on for the next couple of months. And the more I read, the more I became convinced that there was something in this. So it was quite disturbing. So I thought, now I need to look into this myself. So now I'm a scientist, so I needed to do some scientific research. But as a scientist, I also know that scientific research with an n equals 1 is a waste of time, except, of course, when the 1 is you. So I decided it was time for me to do an n equals 1 experiment on myself. So I decided I would do 3 months of this sort of low-carb, healthy-fat diet that Noakes and others were advocating, and I would see what happened. And I was pretty skeptical. I thought, look, it's not going to make, maybe it'll make a little bit of difference. So on day 1, I got all my bloods taken and jumped on the scales, and I stopped eating basically all carbs. So I stopped eating anything with sugar, all the starchy foods, so rice, pasta, potato, cereals, etc. Stopped all that. Stopped all fruit juices, and most fruit. The only fruit I had was berries, and basically all processed food. So I really went back to eating probably the way that my grandparents had eaten, just real food. So meat, fish, eggs. All that cholesterol we've been told for years. Butter and cream and so on, all that fat. Can't have that. So I went back to eating that way really. Lots of green veg and as I said, berries for fruit, some nuts. I mainly drank water. I didn't drink fruit juice or anything like that. Coffee and tea, and I had the odd glass of red wine. That was about it. And the little indulgence was a little square of dark chocolate every night. So I started that diet, and the first thing that happened was that I stopped being hungry. So, instead of sort of having my cereal for breakfast at 8 o'clock and getting to 10:30 and thinking, God, is it lunchtime yet? I would have, bacon and eggs and avocado or something for breakfast, and I wouldn't feel hungry all day. So I went from eating, 3 meals and 3 snacks a day to eating 2 meals a day, and I eat 1 to 2 meals a day now. It hasn't changed. So that was a big difference. I stopped that constant hunger. And then I started to lose weight. Every week I'd jump on the scales, and I thought at first, it's just fluid and just a bit of, but kept on losing weight. And then a whole lot of different sort of things. I started to feel better, more energetic. I concentrated better. I slept better. I wasn't as drowsy during the day. My exercise capacity increased, and it sort of blew me away. All the sort of the changes in my body and health. And so at the end of the 13 weeks, end of the 3 months. I'd lost 13 kilograms in weight, and I'd never been hungry. I'd eaten lovely food. I'd eaten as much as I wanted to eat of this food, and yet I kept the more fat I ate, the more fat I kept losing. I mean, it was bizarre, and as well, I'd had hungry, and then I did my bloods, and all of my metabolic abnormalities had resolved. So my triglycerides went back to normal, my insulin went back to normal, and my fatty liver, which I, by then realised was a pre-diabetic condition, completely reverted to normal. The blood tests were absolutely normal and have remained normal ever since. So I thought that's a pretty good 3 months' work. I guess, when that happens, Mikki, you can, you've got 1 or 2 choices. You can either say, well, okay, I'm all right, mate, and bury your head in the sand and then keep going and feel pretty good. or you can sort of say, well, I think I really need to tell people about this. You know, I mean, I've had this experience. I'm not, no, I wasn't pretending I was the first by any means, but, you know, I had a little bit of influence through my, you know, sort of profile. And I thought, oh, here's an opportunity to try and to teach people this. And so I started talking about it and writing about it, and got involved with the low carb group in Australia, Low Carb Down Under, and started speaking at their conferences and things. And yeah, one thing led to another. I started a not-for-profit called Sugar by Half, with the aim of reducing the amount of added sugar by a half in Australia, and that's been going along well. We've got a schools program, and we've got some promotional stuff, and then I got asked to write a book. A couple of years ago, and to be honest, my initial response was, well, the last thing the world really needs is another diet book. But the publishers convinced me that there weren't many by doctors and none by Australian doctors. So they convinced me to write that book, and I actually wrote it in 3 weeks. So I clearly must have had in the back of my mind exactly what I wanted to write. So I just locked myself away for 3 weeks and finished and did this book, and it's been it was on the bestseller list for a number of weeks, and it continues to sell well. So and then most recently, I've been continuing to give lots of talks and things like that. But the elephant in the room has always been type 2 diabetes, and it seems to be just getting more and more of a problem every year in our separate countries. And nobody seemed to be doing anything about it. And
yep.
I kept waiting and nothing happened. So I thought, well, it's time to do so. There's a very successful program in the UK run by diabetes.co.uk. And we initially tried to sort of license their program, but that got a bit too hard. So we decided, well, we'll have a crack ourselves. So I got together with Paul Mason, one of my fellow sports physicians, actually, and low carber, and Nicole Moore, a dietitian, and we put together this program called Defeat Diabetes, which started off as an app-based program and is now both an app and a web-based program, and that basically just has a whole bunch of videos and articles and recipes and meal plans and cooking demos and so on, everything you need really to understand undertaking a low-carb lifestyle if you've got type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, or even if you just want to avoid getting type 2 diabetes. And that's been going well. We've had about 8,000 people do our program.
Amazing.
We'd like to have a lot more, but we're slowly battling away, and it's a difficult sell. I mean, we've got lots of people who don't want things to change, and they've got a lot of influence. But we've got to keep bashing away, and hopefully we can influence a lot of people.
Peter, there is so much that I'd love to pick up on just based on what you've told us about. And one of the first things I find really interesting is that Prof. Tim Noakes, he is like such a guru in so many different areas, and it's amazing to me the pushback. Probably, I don't know why it's amazing the pushback that he had received, but there are these people who are clearly so intelligent and so smart, and they've got nothing to gain from sharing their knowledge. Yet there are these people, that there is this pushback against anything that sort of doesn't toe the party line, if you like. And what kind of things do you think it would take for authorities in the field to actually start taking notice? I mean, what are your thoughts around those kind of things?
Yeah, look, that is absolutely logical. I mean, clearly, if you actually listen to what Noakes and others say, it makes a lot of sense. So you would think, that I guess that the issue we've all had is that, well, how come if it's obvious to me, why isn't it obvious to everyone else? And but you've got to remember that there's a few factors. I mean, I think one is that people feel very threatened. If you've been telling someone for 20 or 30 years that you've got that low fat is the way to go, and have as many carbs as you like, and saturated fat's evil and cholesterol's evil and all this sort of stuff, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of wackers come along and say, no, you're wrong. I mean, most people, unfortunately, tend to sort of react to that by being, aggressive, defensive, and protecting their their territory. I mean, it takes a lot to admit that that you've been wrong, or that that the evidence has changed and so on. I mean, that's a tough call, and obviously, Tim was able to do it, and I was able to do it. But I can understand why. I suppose dietitians, I guess, who've been preaching the same thing and teaching the same thing for so long, are reluctant to admit that what they've been saying might not be totally correct. So, and you've also got to remember that doctors in particular know nothing about nutrition. We get zero teaching. I had zero lectures on nutrition. In fact, I was at a 70th yesterday of some of my old medical friends, and we all agreed that none of us could remember getting a single lecture on nutrition in our medical course. And I don't think things have improved that much. So doctors tend to sort of stay in their comfort zone. I mean, we all do. We all stay in our comfort zone, and doctors' comfort zone is medications and surgery. It's not. Nutrition is not exercise, so we tend to sort of just ignore that or pass that off to to the dietitians or someone. So so doctors are very reluctant to sort of get involved and also don't have time to talk to patients about diet and things like that. So, between the dietitians and the senior medical specialists, who are pushing back against these ideas, it's very challenging. The interesting thing is that a lot of the young doctors, young GPs, young sports doctors, young dietitians, are embracing this the low carb approach. But many of them, understandably, are scared of sort of speaking out because they've seen what happened to the likes of Tim Noakes and Gary Fettke and people like that, and they don't want to be to threaten their career. I guess for people, for old farts like me, I'm at the end of my career, so if somebody takes me on, it's not a huge problem. But I can understand why people are sort of staying under the radar, if you like. So. It's going to take time. I think it's slowly changing. Things are slowly moving, and I don't think it'll be too long before the dietitians and some of the senior medical specialties acknowledge at least that low carb is an option. Even if it's not their preferred option, that it is an option for the management of chronic disease like type 2 diabetes and so on. But we can only hope.
Yeah, sure thing. And I found it really interesting how you mentioned that you knew that you were generally healthy, but then you started to relay to me all of the metabolic issues that were underlying your general health at sort of age 60, fatty liver being one of them. Like, how much do you think that actually occurs, that people sort of say to themselves they're generally healthy, but actually underlying it, they know they've got these issues that they're not really addressing?
Yeah, well, they may know or they may not know, but I mean, certainly, if we think about type 2 diabetes, it's probably the most common, chronic disease that we have. I mean, it looks like in Australia anyway, there's about 2 million people with type 2 diabetes. Not sure of the figures, but I'm sure that it's proportionally the same in New Zealand. Now, that's a hell of a lot of people, and if you look at the people over 50, there's a very significant proportion of them with type 2 diabetes. Now, they don't develop type 2 diabetes overnight. You don't become type 2 diabetic, you're normal one day and you're type 2 diabetic the next. That's a long process of insulin resistance and so on. That's probably 10, 20 years, but often, during that process, you don't really have any hints. You might be getting a little bit thick around the waist and so on, but generally you're okay. And then all of a sudden, you have a blood test and you're type 2 diabetic because your pancreas sort of can't cope with the demands and the insulin sort of starts to fail. So it's a gradual process, but unfortunately, if you act early, as I said, I'm quite sure I'd be well and truly type 2 diabetic by now if I hadn't made these changes. And yet, the changes were not that difficult. They've not been that hard to maintain. That's the other thing that people think. People are very wary about, and you would know this better than any as a dietitian. As a nutritionist, to me, diet is it's a four-letter word. It's a dirty word, isn't it? And most people have tried. Most people have tried different diets, and they failed because the general diet that people try involves some sort of reduction in calories, and those diets are just not sustainable because you're hungry. If you're I defy anyone to go on an 800 calorie a day diet and stay on it for long, because you're hungry. You're hungry and angry. And it just makes it so difficult. So invariably, people after a day, a week, a month, 6 months, give up on that diet because it's not sustainable. And so they sort of say, "Oh no, diet doesn't work." Whereas what they really need to do is get on the right diet. And I don't even like calling it a diet, because diet to me is something temporary. Whereas this is more just a way of living, a lifestyle, a way of eating, the low carb approach. And the great thing about the low carb approach is that you're not hungry, and that's why it's different from all the other diets. It's sustainable because carbs are the things that make you hungry. Fats and proteins fill you up. So if you're eating primarily fats and proteins, you're not going to be hungry. So it's sustainable. So that was look, I can understand why it's been difficult, but we just need to educate people. And the trouble is, people are not being educated. They've been told the wrong things. They've been told the wrong things to eat. They've been told the wrong reasons why they're obese, and they've been told the wrong solutions. So until we change that, we're not going to solve the problem. I mean, and this whole sort of, it's not just type 2 diabetes. It's all, lots of other chronic diseases that are related to insulin resistance and poor diet. And it's the only solution to our health issues. Otherwise we're just getting fatter and sicker, and the health bill's going up, but it's not affordable, and it's not sustainable. You've got to act at the source, and the source of a lot of ill health is poor nutrition, and the sooner we realise that, the better.
Totally, Peter. And I look at the so I think about this from a public health perspective, right? And Australia and New Zealand are no different. We've got the same guidelines. They're actually set up by the same sort of groups with regards to the dietary guidelines, the RDIs. They're interconnected. And whilst the dietary guidelines, and I know I've said this before on, listeners will hear me say this a bit on podcasts, is that those dietary guidelines might be sufficient for a healthy population, yet we've got a majority of our population that are unhealthy. So to continue to recommend that people base their diet around whole grains and foods like that is just sort of setting people up to fail. Because as you say, then people get that idea that this is what they need in order to be healthy, whilst actually to course correct, we need a different approach.
Yeah, no, look, it's absolutely right. I mean, the dietary guidelines are a huge issue. And as you say, there's a couple of issues with them. One is, as you say, they're set up for healthy people, and very few people are healthy. There was these surveys in the US, which a couple of years ago came out and said that only 12% of the population were metabolically healthy, and this year it came down to 7%. And I suspect Australia and New Zealand is not that different. So they're not appropriate for most people, but they're not even right for healthy people. They're going to lead to chronic problems. And the problem is that there's a few problems with the dietary guidelines. Obviously, they're heavily industry affected. Industry has a huge influence on these issues. Similarly with health star ratings and all this sort of stuff. I mean, the food industry doesn't want things to change because they're doing very well out of the current situation. Thank you very much. And they don't want things to change. And also, as we mentioned, some of the sort of the more senior members of the dietitians and medical fraternity who are involved in these guidelines, don't want things to change. And in fact, in the last Australian guidelines, they didn't even examine the issue of low carb diets. They said, oh, there was nothing new, or some pathetic excuse like that. I mean, it's just scandalous, really, that they ignore all the evidence that's out there now. So we're revising our guidelines again. I'm not that optimistic things are going to change, because the makeup of the committee, you look at it and it's the same old people. And I know some of the, say, Dr. James Mikki, for instance, who was the Australian of the Year in 2020, who's a low sugar advocate and so on, was promised a position on the committee by the health minister, and sure enough, in the end, it didn't happen, because he would have stirred the pot too much. But it's quite scandalous, really. That these people are ignoring the evidence that's out there to support to low carb. But eventually, people power will win out, and there are that many people who are benefiting from this nutritional approach, that they're teaching the doctors. They're going to their GPs and telling the doctors why they've lost weight and improved their metabolic health. And eventually it's going to the doctors will get it. So
yeah. Well, I spoke to Eric Westman, and that was how he sort of his introduction into Dr. Atkins' approach was exactly that. Of course, that was like 20 years ago. And Peter, I think even though this is stuff that you were very familiar with, and it's your sort of stomping ground, I think people aren't aware that that's what happens up at that sort of public health policy space, of how industry focused it is. So I think it's really good to talk to the likes of people like you, who are very sort of knowledgeable as to what goes on, because it just at least highlights why there are this disconnect between the things that I might say and you might say versus what you actually hear in that public health space.
Yeah, look, I think a classic example is the sugar tax. And the sugar tax is not the be all and end all, but it's it would be a very valuable weapon in our battle to improve metabolic health. And that was suggested in Australia, and industry mobilised their troops and shut it down within about 48 hours. The politicians were coming out and saying, "Oh no, we can't do that." So there was just a classic example of the power of industry, and their politicians won't admit it, but they're not going to go against their the people that fund them, and they have huge influence in political circles. They have lots of lobbyists around Parliament and so on, and we can't compete with that. It's very difficult, and so we just have to rely on grassroots. So it's going to be basically a bottoms up movement. It's really just the people out there who are experiencing the benefits themselves and spreading the word, and eventually there'll be enough people spreading the word that even the politicians will realise there might actually be some votes in it, and that's when they might do something, but not until then, unfortunately. They're not really worried about people's health. They're more worried about their party funds.
Totally. And Peter, when you sort of embarked on this approach, I can imagine you might have been quite delighted with the types of foods that you were able to eat. Did people sort of raise an eyebrow as to your meal choices at the time? And how did your colleagues respond when as you were sort of undergoing your transformation?
Yeah. Well, people thought I was crazy, of course, and a lot of my medical colleagues who are pretty conservative, thought, because they sort of think, it's a fad diet, just everything in moderation, everything in balance, well, why would you have things that are bad for you in moderation is what I say. But, it's funny. I mean, when it was okay to remove fat, but it's not okay to remove carbohydrate. Oh, you can't take out a food group. Well, hang on a minute. You've been telling us for 40 years to take out one particular food group. We're just changing the food group you've got to take out. But they don't seem to see that. So, yeah, look, people. But the interesting thing, Mikki, I thought people are really interested. When I've when I lost all my weight, people who hadn't seen me for a while, would always want to know and come up and when I give talks, there's a huge amount of interest in this because people get it. It's sort of logical and it makes sense. And so there's a lot, I think there's a lot of interest out there in the public. I mean, I read that keto is the most searched word on Google as far as food and diet goes. So there's a lot of people out there interested in this sort of a whole area, and it's just a pity that it's the people having to lead it rather than our professions, which should be the ones leading the way. But the patients are leading the doctors in this situation. But no, look, I don't find the diet that difficult, to be honest. People sort of say to me, I couldn't give up rice. Well, I say, well, I have cauliflower rice. It's probably tastier than normal rice. People say, oh, but what about pasta? Well, I have, zucchini, noodle pasta, which is just as tasty, and you can have all the nice. So the funny thing is, I remember, years ago, I used to love spaghetti carbonara, and I used to feel guilty about the carbonara part of it, and now I feel guilty about the spaghetti part of it. It's so there's alternatives. People say, "Oh, I couldn't do without bread." Well, I have the odd piece of sourdough bread, and in my smashed avocado, or I bake my own bread, or there are some low carb breads around that are tasty. And there's even low carb and no carb beers these days.
Yes.
We have 2 beers in Australia that are 0 carbs, which are very tasty.
Yes, I've heard.
I'm not a big beer drinker, but I mean, if I do, I'll have one of those. So, there really is. I eat really well. I mean, I enjoy every meal I have. If my first meal of the day, I'll have an egg-based meal. Usually, if I'm sort of at home and I've got time, so I might have eggs and bacon and avocado and or mushrooms or something like that. Or if I'm in a hurry, I'll have some Greek yogurt and full-fat Greek yogurt with some nuts and seeds and some berries. So. They're both pretty good starts to the day, and then the evening meal I'll just have meat or fish and veg, and just avoid the starchy veg. So and people always say, oh, but what about when you go out? You can't. It's very easy. You can always find something on the menu when you go out. I mean, even people say, oh, what about Italian restaurants? You can't have pasta or pizza. Well, there's always a veal dish or a meat dish on an Italian restaurant. So I don't think I've been to a single restaurant or a hotel and I've spent the last most part of the last 10 years on the road with the cricket team, and I've eaten in hundreds of hotels and hundreds of places and so on, and I've never had a problem finding something nice to eat. So it's a bit of a myth that's really difficult. Particularly as you're not that, you don't have that hunger, so that makes it a lot easier. And the other thing is that, you feel so good on it. I mean, that's why it's so sustainable, because people say to me, oh, how do you keep on it? I said, well, I just feel good, and my weight's good, and I've got a lot of energy, and people say, how well you look, and, I feel, I feel significantly better at 70 than I did at 60 or even 50, I would think. So, it's just a no-brainer for me. And a lot of my colleagues are the same. I gave a talk. I gave a talk 2 months ago, and bumped into a guy the other night who was at that talk. He proudly came up to me and said, "Look at me. I've lost 9 kilograms in 2 months.
Amazing.
And felt fantastic, and just from going to a talk, So, I mean, every time I get despondent, which you do occasionally, because you feel as though you're bashing your head against a brick wall, and the powers that be don't want to listen. Then you get an email or a text saying, I've reversed my type 2 diabetes, or I've lost, 9 kilograms, and, thank you for changing my life. And you think, oh, okay, well, maybe I will keep going after all, So it's, it's a bit of a roller coaster, but yeah, anyway. And it just, the other interesting thing is that, initially I thought it was all just about weight loss and maybe diabetes and so on. But as I've sort of explored more and more over this last decade, I've come to appreciate that most chronic diseases can be significantly improved by changing your diet. It seems that, the causes of chronic disease are chronic inflammation, again, affected by diet, insulin resistance, affected by diet, and your gut microbiome. They seem to be the 3 major issues that cause the factors in chronic disease, and they're all significantly improved by reducing your carbohydrate intake in your diet. And so, from diseases as varied as obviously gut diseases, cardiac issues, hypertension, epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, even now down to mental health. I was in the coffee queue at university the other day, and a lady came up to me and said, "Oh, Dr. Brukner." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, I enjoyed your lecture the other day." I said, "Oh, that's good." And she said, "Oh, but that's not what I want to talk to you about." And I thought, "Oh gosh, what have I done here?" And she said, "My husband and I are massive cricket fans, and because of you, we changed our diet." And I just wanted to say my husband's been bipolar all his life, and he's now off all his medication, and you've changed our lives.
Amazing.
And I thought, wow,
Yeah.
No one ever came up to me when I fixed their ankle and said, "You've changed my life. You fixed my ankle." So it's that sort of thing is the thing that keeps you going, and keeps me motivated and wanting to keep working towards educating people and changing the way they eat. So, there's a wide variety of different diseases that are significantly improved by diet. One of my best mates was sort of crippled by an inflammatory arthritis, and I've got him on a virtually a zero carb diet, and he's halved his medication, and he's moving around again, and he's a different person, And interestingly, his wife went on the same diet, and she said, "Well, I've never really complained about it, but I've had sore joints all my life, and it's the first time in my life I've not had sore joints." So all these different things you hear about, that almost by accident that people fix these chronic issues. It's quite incredible, really. I can't think of there's no medication or nothing else in life that has a dramatic effect on chronic disease as getting your diet right.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, and I think that you often hear the narrative, "Oh, it's just too hard," and it's almost like it's doing such a disservice to so many people who would really benefit, because a lot of that pain that is reported is exactly what you were describing, with people being worried about being hungry. It's not an issue. Being worried about having to give up bread. Actually, you probably don't think about it when you are experiencing a lot of the appetite regulation effects, and like those cravings just are not the same. It's not that you would never have cravings, but it's just so different when you are able to control your blood sugar with your diet. Yeah. Dr. Brukner, as well, you actually just mentioned that one of your friends had benefited greatly from, going on a very low carbohydrate diet. And I did actually want to ask your opinion on the emergence of, much more of an elimination type approach, like a carnivore approach for chronic disease. Like, how much of that are you aware of in the space that you're in, and any thoughts on it?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of interest in carnivore type diet. And it's really, as you said, it's really an elimination diet, isn't it? I mean, it's basically removing all the potential causes of inflammation in particular. I'm very interested in inflammation, in chronic low-grade inflammation as a cause of disease. And in fact, the guy I was telling you about, I actually put him on a carnivore diet, and he's done really well. I don't necessarily advocate that everyone should be on a carnivore diet, but I think it's certainly an option, and a very good option, particularly for people with chronic disease, with autoimmune disease, for instance, and different diseases. It seems to work, very, very well. It's whether you call it an elimination diet or a carnivore diet, it's basically just eating meat and fish and some very mild sort of maybe some vegetables and fruit, but it's primarily just eating very plain food. And then I'm inclined to, once then you're going to have a dramatic effect on their health. There's no doubt about that. What I tend to do then is sort of ease people back into, challenge them with particular foods, and if they have particular favourite foods they would like, like I'd love to have avocado. I say, okay, well try some avocado and see how you go, and so on, because we all seem to have different things that trigger off our inflammation. Some people find dairy inflammatory. Some people find eggs inflammatory. Some people find nightshade vegetables inflammatory, and so on. There's no one sort of diet for everyone. The best way of getting rid of the inflammation is to eliminate them all and just get back to very basic sort of animal foods, and then slowly reintroduce them and find out what are the particular triggers that you have that cause that inflammation and so on. So I'm fascinated by the carnivore diet because it's really against all the principles that that we've been taught in nutrition. We shouldn't just focus on one thing. I mean, But I do think the carnivore diet is probably healthier than the vegan diet if you're talking about extremes because in fact meat is I think probably the most nutritious the nutrient dense food that you can have.
Absolutely.
And certainly from a health point of view, leaving aside any sort of ethical issues you might have with meat and so on. I think the environmental issues are grossly exaggerated in meat, and I think what was proposed in New Zealand is scandalous. That they're going to restrict farmers from producing meat. It's the healthiest food we have, and it's probably better for the environment than growing crops. And you've got to remember when you plough a field, you kill thousands of small animals. But that seems to be okay. But you're not allowed to kill big animals. It's a very bizarre way of thinking. But so from a health point of view, I'm a big advocate of animal foods. Meat and fish and dairy and eggs are I think incredibly nutritious.
Yeah.
They give you great protein, healthy fats with no no crappy carbohydrates in there. So. I think it's a very healthy way of eating. It's not right for everyone. It's pretty extreme, and some people are prepared to do that because they feel so much better. And I get that. When you do something that makes you feel a whole heap better, then it's very motivating. It might be difficult, but it's very motivating to continue on, and that's what I've found from people. And sometimes they'll go off track for a little while and then suffer the consequences. And then after a week or so, they say, "Oh no, well that didn't work. I'll get back on the carnivore or the whatever the keto or whatever the diet is." But there isn't one diet for everyone. I don't advocate ketogenic diet for everyone. I don't advocate carnivore for everyone. I mean, there's a right amount of carbs for everyone. Now, if you're, type 2 diabetic, morbidly obese, got one of those chronic diseases we've been talking about, that's probably pretty small. They're pretty minimal. It might be 30 grams, 50 grams. You might be at the ketogenic end of the low carb diet, if you like. But on the other hand, if you're young, healthy, insulin sensitive, don't have any issues, I mean, you can have, 100, 120 grams of carbs a day. No one should be having the 200 to 300 that, most people have. That's crazy. But, so there's no one amount of carbs. It's a matter of finding out what's right for you. Now, when I went on my sort of 3-month, experiment, I was probably, 30, 40 grams of carbs a day, virtually no carbs. And then since then, I've just backed off a little bit. I probably have 60 or 80 grams. I've never really measured the amount, but my guess would be 60 or 80 grams of carbs a day. And that's right for me. It keeps my weight steady, keeps my health, keeps me feeling good. And that's right for me. That doesn't mean it's right for you or for your patient or anything like that. You've got to find the right diet. But the principles are the same. Real food. I mean, that's what it boils down to. If we can avoid processed and ultra-processed food and just that wonderful saying, JERF, just eat real food, JERF. I like that. If you're only taking one message away, then that's probably the good one to take.
No, that's a great one. And now, as I understand it, you obviously you've spent a lot of time with the elite sports people, particularly the cricket team. I used to love the Australian cricket team; they're amazing. And I think it was actually
Australians don't seem to love them much, but anyway,
No, this was some time ago. I'm thinking back in the heyday of New Zealand and Australian cricket. But I understand that your diet principles, you were able to help a few of the players, or at least one player in particular. I remember hearing a case study, just really help control his inflammatory sort of response. And I think it really sort of highlights that to be a good athlete, you actually need to think of health as well as just as performance. And that's an important piece.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, look, I mean, I looked after the cricket team for 5 years and look, they had a dietitian. So I was, I kept pretty much in the background. I didn't sort of push my dietary ideas, but the players would come to me. I mean, particularly, when I lost all my weight, they all sort of came and said, "Oh, what have you done, Doc?" And so one player in particular came up to me. We were on a tour of India, and he was a player who he initially came to me and said, "Look, I'd like to lose some weight." He was probably 2 or 3 kilograms overweight. It's amazing how many elite athletes, despite training all day, 24/7 virtually, are a little bit overweight, and it's probably because they all eat so much carbs. But he came to me and said, "Look, I want to lose a bit of weight," and so on. And he had an interesting history. He'd had pain in one of his knees for the previous 2 or 3 years, to the point where at one stage he had to stop playing. And he'd been to see every specialist around. He'd had MRIs, he'd had arthroscopies and so on. No one could work out what on earth was going on with this knee of his. And he was really looking at the end of his career. Anyway, he eventually finished up with a rheumatologist who said he diagnosed a seronegative arthritis, which is similar to a rheumatoid type arthritis, and put him on some pretty heavy duty medication, and that sort of helped him about 50%. And then put him on some fairly new injectable medication that made a big difference. So it got him to about 90% right. And when I met him on this tour, he was injecting himself every fortnight with this drug. And he'd said to me that, about day 10 of the fortnight, his knee would start to ache, and he knew it was time for another injection, and then he'd have his injection and feel good for another couple of weeks. So anyway, so he came to me and said, could he like to try the diet that I'd been on and to lose some weight? And I said, sure. And so he did, and he was very good. I mean, India is not the easiest place to go on a low-carb diet, but he managed that pretty well. And he was very conscientious. The good thing about elite sports people is they're pretty disciplined, which is good. Anyway, 3 weeks later, he came up to me and said, "Doc, I forgot to have my injection last week. Should I have it now?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, I didn't get any knee pain, so I didn't get that reminder, and now I've just realised it's 3 weeks, And I said, "Well, have you got any knee pain?" He said, "No." And I said, "Well, why don't you wait and see?" I pretended that, of course, that's exactly what I expected, which was a bit of a fib. But anyway, to cut a long story short, no further knee pain, no further drugs. This drug costs $15,000 a year, by the way, these injections, and basically. And that hadn't controlled him completely. So he's now off all his drugs. He's still low carb. This was 9 years ago now. He's still on a low carb diet, and his wife is, and family is. He's a big advocate of it. And at that time, he actually wasn't even in the Australian team. He was in the sort of touring party, but he couldn't crack the team. And 12 months later, he was in the top 10 batsmen of the world. And so that. And I came across that totally by accident. I'm the first to admit that I had no idea that would happen. But when it did, that really opened my mind. And I guess that was probably the single thing that really showed me the importance of inflammation and the effect of diet on inflammation. And so that blew me away. And so consequently, I've had lots of people with arthritis and change their diet and significantly reduce their pain. In fact, we've got a study going at our university at the moment with a PhD student looking at the effect of what we're calling an anti-inflammatory diet on those with knee osteoarthritis, and the initial results have been very, very encouraging. So it's it's fascinating. And a couple of the other cricketers, one of the other cricketers had always battled with his weight, had huge weight issues all through his career, and he had the biggest appetite of anyone I've ever met in my life. He could eat a horse, literally. And he would, you'd go out to dinner with him and he'd have, 2 entrees and 2 main courses. It was incredible. But anyway, I always made sure he was paying, not me. But he always battled. And as he said, the only way he could lose weight was to starve himself, and he would be miserable. He'd get depressed and so on. Until he discovered low carb, and it just changed his life. And he was able to eat enough to keep himself full, and but not put on weight. In fact, lose weight. And it prolonged. He was, when he started, he was probably, most people would have considered him to be at the end of his career, and he then prolonged his career by half a dozen years, and had the best years of his career because he wasn't constantly battling this this weight. And so there was a number of the cricketers got into the healthy diet, and similarly with AFL footballers and a whole range of different athletes are discovering that reducing it, because athletes have been so carb focused. I mean, we come from the carb generation. I mean, it's all been pasta parties the night before the marathon, and Gatorade and Powerade and gels, and pasta, carbs. And it really worries me that we've had this whole generation of elite athletes who've had massive amounts of carbs. A lot of it's simple carbs. And what the long-term effect of that is, it worries me, that what's going to happen to them in the long term. But fortunately now people are realising that they're tending to be very sort of carb specific, so they might just have carbs on their really heavy training day, and the rest of the time they'll go on a more of a fat and protein based diet. So the world of sports nutrition is also slowly changing, somewhat reluctly in some cases, but and particularly the ultra endurance athletes are now, primarily all gone ketogenic, because you don't have to keep refueling. You can just keep as long as you don't have to do really high intensity exercise, you can keep going for a long time without having to constantly be eating and drinking and refueling during Ironmans and 100-kilometre races and things like that. So
absolutely,
things are changing. It's a fascinating time in nutrition and in sport, both in metabolic nutrition and in sports nutrition.
Yeah, for sure. And my friend Dan Clues, he has a right fuel, right time approach to nutrition, which is exactly what you were talking about with that carb specific. And it's interesting, Peter, I feel like, there's that group in Australia that seem to do their best to try and dispel the idea that anything other than the sports nutrition guidelines are warranted. And even if you look at, the actual guidelines of, say, 8 to 10 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And then you look at the habitual diet of athletes, where historically they get to about 5 or 6 grams, and that's like the elite. To suggest that they could then even eat to the recommendations seems a little bit ludicrous to me, that their performance would massively increase by just having more of the carbohydrates. So I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, look, I mean, certainly, carbohydrate, is a good fuel, for athletes, but but there is an alternative, and that is much healthier. And there are other advantages of being fueled by mainly fats and so on, is that, you recover better, you don't have as much inflammation. And as I mentioned before, you don't have to constantly keep refueling, because we can use our own body fat to fuel ourselves. So there's a lot of advantages. Certainly the really elite athletes, certainly need some carbs, and that's there's no doubt about that. At very high intensity, most athletes, I certainly have athletes who are very high level that are ketogenic, but a lot find that for that really high intensity sort of training session or competition, that they do need some carbs, but again, nowhere near the sort of levels that we used to be advocating 10 years ago. That's for sure.
Yeah. And finally, your Defeat Diabetes program. So I'm super interested in this, and obviously I'm aware of Virta Health and some of the information sort of coming out of that. Is it akin to something like the Virta Health program, but a more of a self-directed approach?
Yeah, look, I mean, as I said at the start, I kept waiting for someone to do something about, diabetes, and nothing was happening. And yet there are very good examples overseas. I mentioned the diabetes.co.uk program, which is like a rebel diabetes site in the UK. They've had over 400,000 people do their program, and with great success, and they've written up their results, and they've been very impressive. Similarly, the Virta Health program in the US. Different medical system and much more expensive, but still very good results. Both of these groups seem to be able to put more than 50% of people with type 2 diabetes into remission. Which is not supposed to be able to happen. we're told as medical students, that type 2 diabetes is a chronic progressive disease. There's no cure. You'll be on medication for the rest of your life. We'll just try and avoid some of those complications. And yet, quite clearly, these programs have shown that you can put type 2 diabetes into remission. And even if you don't get into remission, you certainly reduce your HbA1c and your blood glucose and so on with improved effects. So so we decided we would have a crack at developing our own program, which was sort of Australian or Australasian, if you like, rather than we talk about Vegemite, not Marmite, and important things like that to Australians. But it's a subscription model. So it costs $100 or $99 Australian for a year. We would love to make it free, but it's cost quite a lot to develop, and we're all, myself included, significantly out of pocket as a result. So I'd like to eventually get my money back, but we'll see. I think $100 a week, $100 a year, so $2 a week is probably not too much to put your diabetes into remission. And we've actually got a formal study going on at the moment with a PhD student looking at the effect of 12 months on our program. But in the meantime, we've surveyed our initial sort of cohort of customers, of subscribers. And very similar results to the Virta and the UK results. 50 to 60% into remission, weight loss of 6 to 8 kilograms in 3 months, and so on. So there's no doubt that it's a very effective and works. But we think it's a pretty good program. We get pretty good feedback. We run a whole bunch of webinars as well, and we have a Facebook group, and we put out a weekly newsletter with new recipes and new articles on it, and so on. So it's a pretty comprehensive program. It's part education, part food advice, meal advice, a lot of background information, because we think it's pretty important to understand why you're doing these things. It makes you more motivated if you understand why you've gone low carb and so on. So Paul Mason is a great lecturer and a great speaker, and he's been a fantastic asset. And Nicole is terrific from a food point of view, and so on. So I think it's a pretty good program. And it's available both on the App Store or on a web-based version, just through defeatdiabetes.com.au. And if you jump on that, and you can have a look, and there's a free trial, free 14-day trial, so you don't commit. And the feedback's been terrific. So as I said, we've had 8,000 people do it so far. We're aiming for 100,000 by 2025. So we're on the way, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, for sure. And Dr. Brukner, not only are you generous with your time with me today, I just like to say that you're tireless in this space. You talk so much. You're on in a great way. I see that you're almost everywhere. Plus, your book, A Fat Lot of Good, the Defeat Diabetes program, your not-for-profit. It is amazing to have a voice like you in a space like this, because you and your colleagues are the reason why there is a groundswell happening, because there wouldn't be one if it wasn't for the likes of you. So we really appreciate it, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat to us today. And I will put all of your links in the show notes, because I think $100 to reverse your diabetes, it's just like a no-brainer, basically. So we'll put the link to it.
That's right. Yeah, it's pretty cheap.
Then we'll get you to that, closer to your 100,000 people. So just before we to end off, Dr. Brukner, are you able just to tell people where they can find you and your information? Obviously in my show notes, but if they're just going to Google it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the defeatdiabetes.com.au is certainly a wealth of information as far as the diabetes goes, and it's an entree into the program. Otherwise, A Fat Lot of Good is the book. I said that's got a lot of really interesting information in it, and Yeah, so that's probably a good start. I'm on Twitter. I'm not that active on Twitter, but I'm at Dr. Peter Brukner. But I probably should do more. But I just don't seem to get the time. But I don't know how some people find time to spend their life on Twitter. But anyway, no, I am passionate about it. There's no doubt. But people like yourself, play an enormous role as well. So we really appreciate what you do in spreading the word, and I really appreciate the chance to come on your podcast. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks. Bye.
Alrighty, hopefully you really enjoyed listening to that. Such a wealth of information, and what a professional career. And it's just so awesome now that he has the opportunity to use the success of his career to sort of pivot and help people with improving and addressing their metabolic health. I just love it. Next week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Brendan Egan all about ketones and also exercise and aging. Until then, though, you can find me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or head to my website, mikkiwilliden.com, book a consultation. Easy. All right, team, have a great week. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.